I am so pleased to be able to visit with you this evening. Here we are, 1933, and here we are in Washington for the inauguration of a new president. It is so exciting to realize that we can have this peaceful transition of power. A new president will be inaugurated tomorrow here in Washington. Oh, well, I think this Mr. Franklin Roosevelt, I think he certainly has his work cut out for him. I hear he has some great plans for the country. I am sure he will help in this Great Depression. Why, just yesterday, I was at the White House. I received an invitation from the incoming new First Lady, Mrs. Eleanor Roosevelt. She insists that I call her Eleanor. She gave me a tour of the house. So many things were familiar to me, but there were other things that had changed quite a bit since I once lived there. I know to look at me now, you might not believe it, but I was once the youngest First Lady our nation has ever known. I was barely 21 years old when I married the nearly 50-year-old President Grover Cleveland. You might say that I knew Grover all of my life. Well, you might say that Grover knew me even before I was born. You see, I always called him Cleve. Well, Cleve was my father's law partner, Oscar Folsom. And in many ways, they were very different temperaments, these two men. Cleve always was a stickler for detail. He did not leave his desk until everything on it was arranged correctly and all the work was completed for that day, no matter what the hour. My father, on the other hand, seemed to spend most of his law practice looking for some scrap of paper. But they were more than just law partners. They were the closest and dearest friends. In fact, I received my very first gift from Mr. Cleveland. It was before I was born. He presented my mother with a beautiful imported pram, baby carriage. He had sent away all the way to London for it. A beautiful pearl gray exterior and silk pillows and a silk comforter inside. My mother made good use of it, and my 5 children made good use of it. So you see, I knew Mr. Grover Cleveland all of my life. In fact, when I was a child, I don't recall that there was ever a holiday or a celebration for a birthday that Cleve didn't attend. He was always there for me. As I say, my father, he was a wonderful man, funny, but somewhat unpredictable. And you see, my father, Oscar Folsom, and Cleve, they were members of a men's club there in Buffalo. I was born in Buffalo. And it was not unusual for men to belong to that sort of a club, especially men who were rising in society and rising in the political sphere. Well, one thing that they often did at this club meeting, it wasn't really a meeting, well, they played pool, they played poker, they played pinochle. A lot of drinking went on. And they would have lavish dinners with 10 or 12 courses. In fact, Grover Cleveland held the record at his men's club for eating the most sauerkraut and mashed potatoes in one sitting. Now there's a distinction for you.
Fit right in with our culture.
But he was a wonderful man. He really was my protector, Grover Cleveland. Well, as I say, my father was sort of unpredictable. Well, one evening, there had been one of these dinners at the men's club. It was in July. I was 11 years old at the time. My mother and I weren't at home. We were in Albany visiting my grandparents. And we'd had a lot of rain that July. In fact, that day, I believe it had rained all day long, well into the evening. And as I say, a lot of drinking had gone on. My father decided that he was going to head home in the carriage. Grover tried to talk him out of it, saying, well, why don't we just get a cab for you and we'll take care of the horse. Don't worry about it. My father insisted that he drive home. As I say, my father was unpredictable. But one thing was always predictable. When he was in the carriage, one of his favorite activities was to race cab drivers. And on this particular evening, he found his competition. They raced through the streets of Buffalo. Father apparently was only about a block or so from our home when he lost control of the carriage. The horse fell on the slippery brick pavement, broke its legs. My father was thrown from the carriage. Passersby said he struck his head on a light post. He never regained consciousness. Some of the passersby carried him home, and there he lay unconscious for about 4 hours. I remember it was just starting to get light, and I heard voices downstairs at my grandfather's house. And I heard my mother weeping and shouting. I left my room and I sat down at the top of the stairs. I looked down. My grandparents were holding my mother in their arms, and they were all weeping. My mother held a little scrap of yellow paper in her hand. My mother said, "Whatever will we tell Frankie?" My grandmother saw me at the top of the stairs. She replied, "I think she already knows." Well, I was frightened, to say the least. My mother was frightened. We didn't know if we were going to be able to stay in the house that we had lived in for so long. We didn't know what my father's finances were like, because everything was always in such a jumble with my father. He was an excellent lawyer, but he didn't invest very well. But it was Grover the Good who would come to my rescue and Mama's rescue. He took over the management of all the financial affairs, straightened everything out, made good investments, made sure that Mama and I could stay in the house. He also made sure that there would be enough money to support us and to educate me. He was very insistent that I be very well educated. Well, he grew closer and closer to my mother and I. Most folks there in Buffalo, they started rumors that, I think Mrs. Folsom just may be Mrs. Cleveland any day now. That wasn't meant to be. but he watched over us, always there as my protector, my benefactor. He decided when I was 16 years old that I would go off to college, to Smith College. And the dean of the college received special instructions from the governor. You see, by that time he had risen quite far in his political career. The instructions were that I was not to have a roommate, that I was to have my own suite of rooms in the dormitory, and that no gentleman would be accompanying me at any time. Well, I settled in to college, and I did very well. I enjoyed it. Letters came every week from Cleve, every single week, always asking about my behavior, how was I doing academically, and the dean was required to send a monthly report on my activities and my academic achievement. And every Saturday morning, there would be another bouquet of flowers in my rooms. Tulips, daisies, lilies, carnations, just about every flower one can think of. Oh, Cleve loved flowers. I remember one friend of mine coming into my room. She looked around and there were all these pots of flowers everywhere. And she said, "Looks more like a funeral home than a dormitory room. And besides, why on earth do you have a picture of the governor on your dressing table?" I replied that he was much more than the governor of New York. He was very close. He was my protector. And he would come to visit. It wasn't easy with the governor coming to visit his young ward there at Smith College. Arrangements had to be made, and we couldn't be seen in public together because tongues would be wagging. Well, we would go out to dinner. Arrangements would be made that the restaurant would be emptied long before we arrived, closed only for the use of the governor and his ward. But then he began to ease up on that a bit. Sometimes he would come earlier in the day on Saturday and we would take walks in the park together and, of course, discuss my education and how I was coming along with the French and so on and so forth. And then his letters began to change. I was just about 18 when I noticed that his letters changed, the tone of his letters. They became somewhat more personal, more intimate, you might say. He always signed them, "I have always loved you, Uncle Cleve." Now, on one occasion, I had just turned 18. We had celebrated my 18th birthday at an empty restaurant. And I thought this was a perfect opportunity to ask for something very special. He'd asked me again and again what I wanted for my birthday, and I really didn't think that I needed or wanted anything. But then I came upon something I really wanted. You see, all of the girls were talking about going to see this wonderful Gilbert and Sullivan operetta called The Mikado. And they just kept talking. I'd never been to such a thing, and I thought if I really presented it well to Uncle Cleve, it would work. Surprisingly, he said, "Yes, I'll have the arrangements made." Needless to say, they were very detailed arrangements. But we went to the Mikado that evening, and we had such a wonderful time together. We laughed and we cried, and it was a wonderful time together. When we left the theater, the press had gathered all around out on the sidewalk. As we were walking to the carriage, Cleve whispered to me, "Do you know, that young ingenue in the production, Yum Yum, you remind me so much of her. Well, a reporter overheard that. The next morning, the headlines in all of the newspapers all over the state of New York was, "The governor finds Yum Yum." Well, I suppose you might say the cat was out of the bag by that time. As I say, those letters were changing, and my letters to Cleve were changing. I no longer referred to him as Uncle Cleve. It was Cleve. And I found I was falling in love with him. And his letters, they came more frequent, about every 2 days most of the time, and then the flowers changed. The tulips, the daffodils, the chrysanthemums, the carnations disappeared. And every Saturday morning, the red roses tied with a red satin bow would be on my dressing table when I awoke. Things certainly had progressed between Cleve and I. I graduated from Smith, and Cleve had arranged that my mother and I would go to Europe for several months. We would be accompanied by a friend of my mother's who was quite an expert in French haute couture. I was instructed that I shop for clothing while I was in Paris. More specifically, to have my wedding gown designed. Before I left for Europe, I received a letter from Cleve. It was an apology. He said in that letter, "Please forgive me, you haven't had a proper courting. But I know I will make the best of husbands and hopefully the best of fathers. I love you, my dearest. And in addition, there is a court date before you leave for Europe. Your name will be changed. You see, my name was actually Frank. My father wanted a boy. I was actually Frank Folsom. Everybody called me Frankie, assuming my name was Francis. And so before I left for Europe, I went to court with Cleve, and my name was formally changed to Francis. Well, that was just Uncle Cleve's way. I had a lovely time in Europe, although my mother could be difficult, to say the least. You see, she had always assumed that she would be Mrs. Cleveland. She was very surprised to find out that she would be a mother-in-law instead. And, well, you might say that we never came together on the subject. She simply avoided me for the rest of my life. But I returned from Europe with a beautiful wedding gown, heavy, ribbed and quilted satin. It was so heavy that the dress could actually stand out by itself. And the designer did something quite wonderful. The sleeves were detachable, and the frontispiece, which was a high lace collar, that was all detachable. And the train on the dress was detachable so that it could be worn for any occasion, really. I had a photograph done in that wedding gown. Cleve wanted something extra on it, so he insisted that orange blossoms be strung down the front of the gown. My veil was Battenberg lace, 30 feet long. Well, the very, very special day came We all made the trip to Washington. By then, he was now Mr. President. June 8th, 1886. I arrived in Washington the day before with Mother and an entourage, trying to avoid the press. Of course, the press had a field day with it, saying, "Oh, well, Mr. Cleveland finally is getting his yum-yum." I was taken to the White House that morning and dressed there. It was going to be a rather small wedding. Just 28 persons would be in attendance in the room, in the Blue Room at the White House. Oh, the flowers. Oh, how he loved flowers. The whole room was just a riot of color. In the fireplaces, there were red begonias to symbolize passion. And around all of the windows and mirrors, there were garlands of ivy and lilies, and there were pink and yellow carnations and white carnations, and every imaginable flower tucked in every crevice of that room. And I would come down the stairs on the arm of my groom. The wedding was slated for 7 o'clock that evening. Cleve did not leave his desk until 6. He had to have it cleared off before he could start anything as momentous as marriage. There I walked down the stairs to the music of the Marine Band, led by John Philip Sousa himself. I think many of the ladies who did come, they were the cabinet wives. Those ladies were more interested in staring at Mr. Sousa than the bride and groom. He did look dashing in his cobalt blue jacket with all that gold braid and those trousers with that absolute perfect crease and the red stripe and the hat. Oh, he was magnificent. He would outshine any bride. There was a little dais set up in the center of the room with an arch. You see, Cleve's brother, Stephen, would be performing the ceremony. And there we stood. Earlier that day, there had been a little discussion between Grover Cleveland and his brother, Stephen. You see, it was a matter of the vows. And that part about obey. Well, Cleve won out. His brother insisted that it stay. Cleve said, "There's no use saying something that will never happen." And so it was omitted from the vows. And then there I stood next to my groom. My mother came up to kiss me goodbye. Somehow she managed to get her feet tangled in the veil, thereby, of course, focusing the attention on Mrs. Folsom's feet. By that time, Cleve was becoming rather irritated. He simply bent down, gave it a good tug, and suddenly my veil was shortened by about 20 feet. We had a little bit of a reception there, only 28 guests, and then we would leave for our honeymoon. We were to honeymoon in Maryland at Deer Park. It was an estate owned by a friend of the president. It was raining so hard that evening. And you see, Cleve had set up a situation so that the press would not know which train we were taking to Deer Park. 2 trains would leave within minutes of each other, heading to Deer Park, but the press wouldn't know which one we would be on until someone paid the station master, who revealed that it was train number 2. We arrived at the train station in Deer Park, and it was mobbed by the press. We had a carriage waiting for us. We left in the carriage. About 1.5 miles from Deer Park, the carriage was stuck in the mud. We left the carriage and walked the final 1.5 miles to our honeymoon suite. It was a beautiful cottage at the edge of the estate, very private. However, the press was up in the trees, watching everything, paying all of the servants and the butlers and the maids. What did they have for breakfast? What time did they get up? What time did they go to bed? Did they ever come out? Nonetheless, it was 2 weeks of absolute bliss. And then reality of now being the First Lady at the tender age of 21. I must say that the press was very enamored of me. Ladies all over the country now wore their hair in what was called a la Cleveland. My clothing was copied. And then I found out that people were using my image to sell everything from horse collars to soap, saying that Mrs. Cleveland would never use any other horse collar than this. I've never worn one. How would I know that I approved of it? Well, I was very disturbed about this. I felt that the public was given the mistaken thought that I was using all of these products and that I identified with them and thought all of these products were the best on the market. Well, I went to Cleveland about that. I said, Cleve, what can I do? I don't want my face being on these products for some bleach that I have never even heard of, that is made in somewhere in Minnesota or Wisconsin or wherever. Aren't there laws? And he said, well, no, but we can fix that. So he talked to a few of his congressman friends and the Senate, and they expanded laws of copyright. And suddenly, my face was now copyrighted. And the purveyors of the bleach and the horse collars and the stoves and buggy whips and whatever could not use my image to sell their product. I found out being the First Lady wasn't so bad after all. But I remember when I was introduced that day to all of the ladies in Washington. There was to be a parade in Washington, and the president would be in the parade. And I was instructed what I should wear. The list was given to me the night before by Cleve. I wore a very pale gray silk traveling suit with a veiled hat. And we were to sit in the ballroom of a hotel there on the street where the parade was to be held. A window seat had been arranged for me, and when I stood at the opposite end of the room, there were all these eyes on me. All of the ladies of Washington, the wives of congressmen and senators and the cabinet and the Supreme Court, and all staring at me. As I stepped one foot into the room, suddenly someone rammed a bouquet of white roses into my hand. And as I walked through the room to the window, I felt I was Moses parting the waters. But there I was, sitting at that window seat, watching the President of the United States, my Uncle Cleve. Well, we had a good run, let's put it that way. He accomplished a very, very high degree of things while he was in that first term. Most people don't give him the credit that is due him. Well, during his first term, he opened up the ports in America, reduced tariffs so we would have greater trade with European nations. He re-examined the pensions that were to be given to Civil War veterans, finding that many of them were false claims. Men who had never served one day in the Union Army were requesting a pension, and many of them receiving it. I think sometimes it was rather an apology from him to those men who did serve in the Union. You see, Cleve did something at that time that many, many people did. He paid another man to take his place. He was a fisherman, I believe it was, from the state of Michigan. He was a Polish immigrant. Cleve paid him $200 to take his place. The man fortunately survived. But then, when Cleve became president, the man showed up on his doorstep one day demanding more money or he'd leak to the press the issue that the president had been, shirking his duty to the Union. Cleve believed in absolute honesty. He told the man, I paid you, and if the press asked, I paid you $200. And that, my dear man, was the going rate. You served. You're fine now. You are eligible for the pension. And if you pursue this, I will make life very uncomfortable for you. And that is the absolute truth. The man never returned, nor did he request anything from the president. But we were going to be leaving the president's house. He lost that election. It was devastating for him. I remember the day that we left by the back entrance of the president's house, and the staff had all lined up, and they were crying and telling us how much they would miss me. So many of the staff had been so wonderful to me. I made so many mistakes and missteps. They always seemed to know who I should be seating next to whom, and never seat Mrs. Smith anywhere near Mrs. Johnson. There could be fistfights. They were so wonderful to me. As I was just stepping through the door, one of the young maids who had been so sweet and kind to me, she came running to me, Mrs. Cleveland, you can't leave without this. Oh, I'd left something very important behind. You see, this little box. This box was designed by Cleve himself. He had them made at Tiffany's in New York. On the top, the C and our intertwined initials, G and F. And inside, each one of our guests at our wedding was given a piece of wedding cake to take home. I couldn't leave that behind. It was much too important. I am so pleased that that young woman remembered that I had left it on the dressing table. Well, we settled into a rather calm and easy existence. Cleve was mostly at his law practice, but he also became a consultant for an insurance company in Connecticut. We had a lovely house there in New Jersey. He was on the board of directors of Princeton, and I was busied with a variety of commitments. And then something very, very important would happen to us. Our first child was born in 1891. Ruth. Oh, Cleve was so pleased at her birth, and she was indeed a sparkling, wonderful little baby girl. Well, we would be back. I had told the staff when we left that day that the Clevelands will be back, and by golly, 1892, and we were back. And we brought our little daughter with us, of course. And she was a favorite of the press. Oh, do you know, in that year, the most popular name for baby girls was Ruth. And she certainly made a difference in our lives. There was something disturbing about having a child there in the president's house, and it indeed is a fishbowl, and the press is always watching you. One day, I glanced out the window, and I saw one of the nursemaids who cared for our child. She was out there on the lawn of the president's house, and a crowd had gathered around her, and she was handing baby Ruth off to all of these strangers. I was terrified. I ran into Cleve's office, and I told him what was happening out there, and needless to say, he was angry, and he rushed out there, immediately fired the young woman. She was charging $2 each for someone to hold my baby daughter. So if you're wondering who is responsible for that fence that goes around the White House, it's me. I insisted that Cleve do something. His solution was the fence around the White House that stands there to this day. And of course, there's been an argument over the years as to whether that certain candy bar was named after our baby daughter. And some say yes and some say no. The candy bar was brought onto the market for the first time in 1893. It didn't sell very well. It was a new item. And so the Curtis Candy Company there in Chicago put it on hold for a while. And then along came a baseball player. And the Curtis Candy Company thought, just maybe if they told people it was actually named after the babe, not the baby, but the babe, it might sell. They even raised the price from 3 cents to 5 cents, and then they were able to sell Baby Ruth candy bars. But we would have our tragedies. I was expecting our second child at that time, getting very near to the time of delivery, when one morning Cleve called me into his office. He said he would be gone for perhaps a few weeks, that it was a very important mission that he had to attend to, that he could not even tell me where he would be, and I would not be able to contact him. He wanted me to go back to New Jersey to some friends of ours who had a lovely house there, and in case the baby decided that he or she would come early, he wanted me to have the care of good friends around me. He wouldn't tell me what had happened. It was years later that I would find out that he would have surgery on his mouth. Apparently one morning he was brushing his teeth and he noticed a rather painful, he thought was perhaps a canker sore at the base of his tongue on the left side of his mouth. And it was quite painful and began to bleed readily. He asked one of the doctors there at the president's house to take a look at it, and apparently the doctor shook his head and he said, "Mr. President, it's very serious." And so arrangements were made to secretly do a very involved surgery on the President of the United States on a ship moored in the harbor. An operating theater was set up. All the physicians were there. When they began the surgery, they realized that it was more involved than they had even considered. They had to remove large portions of tissue, 5 teeth, part of the jawbone, a gentleman who was a skilled artisan in making dentures and other appliances was called in so that he might formulate a rubber shield. It left a gaping hole inside of Cleve's mouth. It would eventually heal over. I stayed in New Jersey for several weeks until Cleve notified me that I could return to the president's house, and I was still awaiting the birth of our daughter. She would be born there at the White House on the Lincoln bed. Only child of a president to be born there. She's a beautiful little girl, Esther. Well, the years passed, and I would finally learn from Dr. Keene. In fact, Dr. Keene had looked after Mr. Roosevelt in the days when Mr. Roosevelt had been stricken with polio back in 1921. I had spoken to Dr. Keene, and he said yes, he had been called in. He felt the only thing that they could do was to remove the portion of the jaw. It was correctly done, masterfully in his opinion. But the public would never know how close the president was to death. Well, our little daughter was born there at the president's house. That second term was difficult. The country went through a major economic depression. There were difficulties with foreign trade. There were riots in the streets with unions, strikes, shortages. I think by the end of that second term, Cleve was worn down. He was ready to leave. We left that house for the very last time. I didn't know that I would ever return there, even as a visitor. We settled in to a lovely house in Deer Park. We had rented that house at different periods while Cleve was president. The children had a more freedom there, you might say, and we could have all of our pets. We had raccoons and rabbits and geese and chickens and turtles, dogs and cats. I was particularly fond of a large poodle that was given to us by the French ambassador. And the children were required to learn French because the dog would only obey in French. But it was a lovely time of our lives. A wonderful time. We would have 5 children, 3 daughters and 2 sons. Cleve was the happiest he'd ever been in his entire life. He was a very active father, even considering his age. He skated and he played ball with the children, and he loved when the snow would come and they would go sledding. It was on New Year's Eve of 1900. The children had been out sledding all day long, and Cleve with them. We were just going to have a quiet supper that evening. And our oldest, little Ruth, she was 11 years old. She complained that she really wasn't very hungry that evening, that she had a terrible headache. Well, I readied her for bed, tucked her in. I was concerned because I could feel that she was beginning to run a fever. I remember Cleve getting up several times during the night and checking on her, and finally he woke me and he said, "I think we have something serious. The poor baby is burning up." He had already called on the doctors. One was coming all the way from New York. Hopefully would be there by morning. The first doctor arrived. He brought another gentleman to consult. They told us that our baby Ruth, why, she had contracted meningitis. And the most important thing was to get all of the other children out of the house. Our cook, she was a saint. She gathered up the children and took them all to her sister's house to make sure that they were safe. As dawn broke on that new year, our little one's life ended. I don't think that Cleve ever recovered. After baby Ruth's death, I would find him in her room. He refused to have anything touched. It had to be just as she left it. I would find him sitting at the edge of the bed, fingering her books, holding one of her dolls in his hand. And then he would carefully replace the books on the shelf and replace the doll where she had been and straighten the coverlet and leave the room, closing the door. I really don't think he ever recovered from her death. But he was kept busy. He was now a consultant again with that same insurance company. The years were beginning to show on him the stresses of the presidency. He began having more and more stomach difficulties. I assume that they were due to his eating habits most of his life. While we were in the president's house, there was a French chef there, and Cleve absolutely despised everything the man made. He would send it back. And one day he went down to the kitchen. He was very angry about the dinner that had been sent up. And as he walked past, he smelled something that was quite enticing. He asked one of the butlers, "What's that?" And the butler replied, "Oh, sir, I am so sorry. That's the staff's dinner." And Cleve said, "It smells like corned beef and cabbage." And the gentleman said, "Yes, sir, that's what it is." Well, Cleve sat down immediately and had his dinner with the staff. Within days, that French chef was gone. He had hired another woman, I believe she was from Holland, a Dutch woman. And he said she knew how to properly treat a potato. So I suppose it was his eating habits that caused his problems. More and more often his stomach was distressed. And then that diagnosis would come. The president had stomach cancer. There was no way that they could treat it by operating. There was too much. It wasn't feasible. He would never recover. He refused to go to the hospital. And so we set up a room in the first floor of the house. It was really a hospital room. We had nurses day and night. And then, just after our wedding anniversary, he passed away. Those last weeks had been such agony for the poor man. But he would never show his distress, especially not to the children. He assured me that I was comfortable, the children were taken care of, and they had always loved me. And I knew that I always had loved him dearly. Grover the Good, always stepping up to fix things, to be my protector. He had risen through the ranks politically in New York. He started out as the sheriff, and he is the only president that I am aware of, only president who actually executed 2 convicts. You see, it was the responsibility of the sheriff to do the hanging. Apparently, Cleve's mother tried to talk him out of it. She said, well, couldn't you hire someone to do this, to pull the lever? And Cleve said, no, it's the responsibility of the sheriff, and I am the sheriff. And so on 2 occasions, he dispatched the convicts. He moved up to be the Attorney General in the state. And there he tried to be honest, forthright. He always said, tell the truth. He'd become governor and president. Grover the Good. A man who still, in my opinion, still to this day does not receive the adulation and the thanks that he deserved. I took his place on the board of Princeton. We moved up to New Jersey. I took his position on the board of directors of Princeton. I'd always been fond of archaeology and ancient history, and so I took the opportunity, being a member of the board of directors, I took the opportunity to attend a class. There was a very wonderful professor there at Princeton by the name of Thomas Preston. He'd been on a number of very famous archaeological digs. And so I started attending his classes. We became very dear friends. He invited me to go on an excursion to Greece. I felt somewhat reluctant, but I enjoyed the trip so much. I had so wanted to travel. By the time we returned from Greece, I realized that we had gone beyond friendship. And so in 1913, I became Mrs. Thomas Preston. And the press was furious. I was absolutely crucified in the press. How can she do this to the president's memory? What is wrong with that woman? And on top of all of that, do you know she allows Dr. Preston to drive the president's car? Well, Thomas and I have been very happy in the past years. And I think we shall continue in that happiness. My mother died. I was set, of course, as the only child to clear all of the household goods. She had never spoken to me in all the years, and when she had remarried, I had sent her a Dresden coffee service as a gift. She sent it back to me, saying, "It just isn't right for me." But being the only child, I had to clear the house. I was looking through papers in my father's desk. I opened the bottom drawer and I found a peculiar file that looked quite rumpled and yellowed. I pulled it out and I began reading it. I can recall that there were stories circulating about the president fathering a child when he was running for the presidency for his first term, a woman by the name of Maria Halpin. And there that name appeared on a birth certificate. A male child was born. But oddly enough, there were 2 birth certificates for the child. One listed Oscar Folsom as the father. The other birth certificate listed Stephen Grover Cleveland as the child's father. Apparently the young woman was a young woman who often entertained the gentlemen at that men's club there in those evenings of drinking and banquets and obviously some debauchery. She was an Austrian immigrant. There was a photograph of her there. She was so beautiful, tiny, frail, had the appearance of a Dresden figurine. Apparently, the child was removed from her, and Grover signed the certificate that she be placed in an asylum for the insane. She was released after about 3 years, hoping to find her child. And then I found an adoption certificate that this child was adopted by a Dr. and Mrs. James King in Syracuse, New York. Curiosity provoked it. I began trying to find this person who very could possibly be my brother. I found out that Dr. James King Jr. was a very prominent physician in New York City. And I thought very hard and very long, and I thought, what good will it do? What good would it do for me to intrude on this man's life? Possibly to destroy his medical practice. No. I shall let that lay just as I found it. Well, I always loved my protector, my benefactor. And I always will have the fondest memories of being our nation's youngest First Lady. Thank you. Thank you very kindly. Thank you. Thank you very kindly. Very briefly, are there any questions that I might answer for you?
What happened to the children?
Well, they would grow up and go off on their own. Our youngest child would become Francis, the male Francis, would become a minister, Presbyterian minister, following in the footsteps of his grandfather. Grover's father was a Presbyterian minister, and so was his brother, William. So our son followed in that footsteps. But they lived happily ever after, one might say.
And the girl?
Married, presented me with many grandchildren. Are there any other questions that I might answer? No, none of them went into politics. Yes, ma'am.
Does your wedding dress still exist?
Yes, it does. Yes, it does. It's at the Smithsonian. One of the sleeves somehow was lost over the years, and so they, I don't know how that happened, but one of the sleeves was lost over the years, but they had a person who is an expert in the reconstruction of a garment, and she was able to reconstruct a new sleeve. But you can tell that it's not quite the same color, because, you know, the natural wear, the color, the discoloration of the silk over the years. But the dress was very, very heavy, very cumbersome, had a very long train, and was very difficult to walk in, actually, because of the weight. It was actually, the bottom of the dress had quilting in it to keep it out and stiff, and it would stand up by itself without any human help. Yes?
Did you get your beautiful outfit
Oh.
in New York?
I'm sorry. The lady asked, where did I get my beautiful outfit? I had to decide, I get to decide what these ladies wear. And I decided that I would feature her in 1933 so that she could have your whole story. And she had to have something very elegant. And so I started with this coat, which was made in Ireland, and then decided she should have some lace because she was a very kind of a frou-frou, feminine sort of lady. And so you just construct her outfit. Her hair, she always had it piled up with the curls and with the bun in the back and everything, a la Cleveland. So you can really just fantasize. One more story, and before I let you go, I got to tell you this little story about Frances Cleveland Preston. 1947, she was invited to the White House. President Truman is president, and they're going to have a dinner with many generals are going to be there. This is just post Second World War. And Mrs. Cleveland is there. She's very elderly now. She was born in 1867, so she's getting up there in years. She was seated next to General Eisenhower. And across from Mrs. Cleveland, Mrs. Preston, was Mamie Eisenhower. And her nameplate on her name card says, Mrs. Thomas Preston. So she's sitting there chatting with General Eisenhower. And he said, oh, are you familiar with the White House? And she said, oh, yes. I've been here before. And General Eisenhower said, oh, did you have a job here? And she said, yes, I did. I had a job here for 8 years. And he said, oh, that's very interesting. In the meantime, Mrs. Eisenhower knows who this lady is. And she is under the table. And Eisenhower's just like, what? What do you want to tell me? And she's saying, this is Mrs. Cleveland. Who? Mrs. Cleveland. And he finally caught on, and she burst into laughter. She said, yes, that Mrs. Cleveland. And he was just, I guess he went right up to his bald head. He was red-faced. But she was that type. She was kind of a little trickster herself. But she went along with him. Oh, yes, I worked here for 8 years. I think that is just, that I can imagine the talk in the car as the Eisenhowers returned to their hotel. What did you think I was kicking you for? So, thank you so much. Oh, one more question.
I just want to thank you. You've been to all.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Well, next year, thank you so much. Maybe next year.